There was a for sale sign in my own front yard, and I'd never once given anyone permission to put it there. I noticed it from the car, pulling back into the driveway on Cedarbrook Lane after my Tuesday shift at the Lutheran Medical Center in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, where I've worked as a billing coordinator for 19 years. The sign was the kind realtors plant with a single metal stake, the photo on it slightly crooked, a phone number I didn't recognize printed under a name I also didn't recognize. Marcus Tran, Highline Realty Group. I sat in the driveway for a full minute just looking at it. The way you look at something that doesn't belong in the picture you're used to seeing. The way a word looks wrong on a page. Even before you've figured out why. I called the number on the sign before I even went inside. A young man answered, professional, upbeat, clearly mid-conversation in his head with a different version of this call than the one he was about to have. Before I tell you what happened next, I'm Elle, and you're watching Beyond Truth Revealed. Hit subscribe and join our growing community. Now, here's what happened. Highline Realty, this is Marcus. This is Patricia Doyle. I'm calling about the sign in front of 44 Centene Cedarbrook Lane. I live here. I'd like to know why there's a for sale sign on my property. There was a pause on his end, the kind of pause that told me he was recalculating something fast. Ma'am, I have this listing under contract with the owner, Gary Doyle. The closing's scheduled for the 17th. Gary Doyle is my son. He's 31 years old. He does not own this house. I have owned this house, free and clear, since 2019, when I paid off the mortgage 3 years early with money I'd saved working double shifts after my divorce from Gary's father. My name, and only my name, is on the deed at the Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder's Office. I know this because I checked it myself, in person, 11 months ago, when Gary first asked if he could be added to the deed just in case something happens to you, Mom, so the house doesn't have to go through probate. I'd told him I'd think about it. I never did anything about it. I assumed that was the end of it. Mr. Tran, I said, I think there's been a serious mistake. I own that house. I have the deed. Gary doesn't own any part of it. Another pause, longer this time. Ma'am, I was provided a copy of the deed showing Gary Doyle as sole owner, along with a quitclaim transfer dated 4 months ago. I can email you the documents I have on file, if that would help clear things up. I stood in my own driveway, in front of my own house, holding a phone with a stranger's voice on it, telling me my own son had filed paperwork transferring my house into his name alone 4 months ago without a single word to me about it. And I felt the particular, specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with Colorado weather in October. I went inside. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it that morning. The same coffee mug in the sink, the same stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter, Gary's old bedroom down the hall still half-furnished, from when he'd moved back in temporarily 18 months ago after his divorce, before moving back out 4 months later into an apartment in Golden he'd told me his new job was covering. Everything looked the same. Only the paperwork underneath it, again, had apparently changed. My name is Patricia Doyle. I'm 56 years old. I raised Gary mostly on my own after his father left when Gary was 9, working 2 jobs through most of his childhood, the kind of mother who learned to read insurance billing codes for a living because the hours worked around school pickup. I am not an unsophisticated woman. I read documents for a living. And somehow, in the 11 months since Gary first asked about the deed, I had not once thought to check whether he'd quietly gone ahead and done what I'd told him I needed time to think about. Marcus Tran emailed me the documents 20 minutes later, sitting at my own kitchen table with my laptop open, the same table where Gary used to do his homework, where I'd helped him fill out his first job application at 16. The quitclaim deed had my name on it as the grantor. My name, typed clean, with a signature beneath it that was close enough to mine, at a glance, in the right light on a screen, to fool a realtor who'd never met me, but was not. I knew the moment I looked at it carefully. actually my signature. I called the Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder's office the next morning, the moment they opened. The woman who answered confirmed it without hesitation, because public record doesn't soften anything for anybody. The quitclaim deed had been filed 4 months ago, notarized, my name on it as the sole signer, transferring the property at 4417 Cedarbrook Lane entirely into Gary Doyle's name, notarized. Someone had stood in front of a notary, signed my name, and gotten that signature stamped and sealed with the full legal weight of the state of Colorado behind it, and I had been nowhere in that room when it happened. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that call, looking at the unopened mail I hadn't touched in 3 days, wondering how many of those envelopes might have something to do with this, wondering how long 4 months actually was when you measured it not in days, but in how much could quietly happen underneath a life that, from the outside, looked completely unchanged. I didn't call Gary right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I sat there instead, turning the word notarized over in my head, because notarized meant somebody else. A real, licensed person with a stamp and a legal obligation to verify identity had either been fooled or had agreed to look the other way, and either possibility meant this had taken more than just my son sitting alone at a desk forging a signature. It meant someone had helped him. Part 2. I called Gary at 7:15 that evening, after I'd had time to write down every question I wanted to ask, in the order I actually wanted to ask them, because I know myself well enough to know that without a list, the anger would take over and the questions would come out in the wrong order, the ones that mattered drowned out by the ones that just felt good to shout. He answered on the second ring. Easy, normal, the same voice he'd used to call me about anything for 31 years. "Hey, Mom, Gary, there's a for sale sign in my yard." The pause on his end told me everything I needed to know before he said a single word. It was the pause of a man who had been expecting this call and had still, somehow, not finished preparing for it. "Mom, okay, I can explain, I promise, it's not what it looks like." "Explain the quitclaim deed then. The one with my forged signature on it, notarized 4 months ago, that I just found out about from a realtor named Marcus Tran." "It's not forged, Mom. You signed those papers, don't you remember? Back in June, when I brought over that folder of stuff for you to look at, the estate planning paperwork?" I did remember a folder. I remembered Gary sitting at my kitchen table in June with a manila folder, telling me it was just some basic estate planning, Mom, so things are simple for you later. And I remembered signing something. I genuinely did remember signing a few pages, skimming them the way you skim things a son hands you, trusting the framing he'd already given it before you read a single word. "Gary, if I signed something I believed was estate planning paperwork that would take effect after I died. I did not sign a deed transferring my house to you while I'm alive and sitting in it." "Mom, I think you're misremembering what was in that folder." That sentence, "I think you're misremembering," landed differently than anything else he'd said so far, because it wasn't an explanation. It was an attempt to make me doubt my own memory instead of explaining his own behavior, and something about the smoothness of it, the readiness of it, told me he'd thought about saying exactly that sentence before this call ever happened. "Gary, I need you to tell me the truth. Did you forge my signature or trick me into signing something I didn't understand the actual purpose of?" A long silence. Then, "Mom, I'm in trouble, okay? I'm in real trouble financially, and I thought if I could get some equity out of the house, fix things quietly, sell it, pay you back eventually with a chunk of the proceeds, you'd never even need to worry about any of it. I was trying to fix something before it became your problem too, by selling my house out from under me without telling me. I was going to tell you before closing. I swear, Mom, that was always the plan." I didn't believe that last part, and I told him so, and he didn't really argue, which told me something too. I called my sister Donna in Aurora that night, The way I'd called her through every difficult stretch of my adult life. Gary's father leaving, Gary's own divorce, the year I'd had the cancer scare that turned out to be nothing but still cost me 4 sleepless months. Donna had never fully trusted Gary's father's side of the family, and over the years that wariness had occasionally extended, gently, to Gary too, in ways I'd usually brushed off as Donna being Donna. "Patricia, I need you to actually hear what you just told me," Donna said. "He's in financial trouble serious enough that he tried to sell your house without telling you. That's not a son trying to protect his mother. That's a man desperate enough to do something he knew was wrong and is now trying to convince you it was almost reasonable. He says he's been struggling since the divorce." "Since the divorce? Or since something else? Patricia, did you know he switched jobs 4 months ago? Around the exact time that deed got filed." I hadn't known that. I'd known he'd told me, a few months back, that his new job was covering more of his apartment costs in Golden. The same conversation where he'd mentioned moving out of my house for good. I had taken that at face value, the way you take most things at face value when they come from your own child and don't immediately contradict anything you already believe about him. "I don't actually know where he's working right now, Donna." I realize that's strange to say out loud about my own son, Doff. It's not strange, Patricia. It's exactly what happens when someone starts managing what you know instead of just telling you things. I think you need to find out 2 things before you do anything else: where his money's actually been going, and who exactly notarized that deed, because whoever stamped that document either got fooled badly or got paid to look the other way, and I don't think you're going to like which one turns out to be true. I sat with that overnight, and the next morning, before my shift at the hospital, I drove to the address listed on the notary's seal stamped at the bottom of the quitclaim deed. A small strip mall office on Wadsworth Boulevard that turned out to be a shipping and notary service, the kind of place that does passport photos and FedEx drop-offs alongside notarizations, busy enough that a single transaction probably didn't stand out much in the owner's memory. The man behind the counter, when I showed him the document and explained who I was, got noticeably uncomfortable in a way that told me, before he said anything, that he remembered exactly what I was asking about. "Ma'am, I notarize a lot of documents. I don't always remember every I-signer. This one has my name on it. I'm telling you, I never came in here." He looked at the document again, at the date, at the signature, and something in his face shifted from professional caution into something closer to genuine concern. "Ma'am, I think you should talk to a lawyer today, because I do remember this one, now that you're showing it to me directly, and the woman who signed this in front of me that day was not the woman standing in front of me right now." Part 3. I called in sick to the hospital for the first time in 6 years and spent the morning, instead, in the office of an attorney named Renata Solis, a real estate and elder law specialist in Lakewood, whose name Donna had pulled from a list she'd compiled overnight, the way Donna handles every crisis. Methodically, before the rest of us have finished feeling the shock of it, Renata listened to the entire story without interrupting once, took notes in a small, tight handwriting, and then set her pen down in a way that told me she'd already started building a strategy in her head before I'd even finished talking. "Patricia, here's what we're looking at procedurally. A notarized document carries a strong legal presumption of validity. Courts generally assume, unless proven otherwise, that the person who signed in front of a notary really was who they claim to be. That presumption is what makes this complicated, but it's not unbeatable. If that notary is willing to state, on the record, that the woman who appeared before him doesn't match you, that's the beginning of a fraud claim that can unwind this entire transfer. But, Patricia, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to think carefully before answering. Is there any chance someone close to Gary resembles you enough, even slightly, to pass as you to someone who'd never met you before?" I thought about it longer than I expected to need to. His ex-wife, Brianna. We're roughly the same build, similar coloring. We're not exactly alike, but to a stranger glancing at an ID for 10 seconds in a busy strip mall office, I suppose? Are she and Gary still in contact? Despite the divorce. He's mentioned her a few times. I assumed it was just co-parenting logistics. They don't have kids together, actually, so I'm not even sure what the logistics would have been. I didn't think much of it. Renata wrote something down. I want Connie, my investigator, not the accountant kind, the kind who pulls phone records and financial relationships, to look into whether Brianna's been involved in any of this. Because Patricia, if she's the one who appeared at that notary's office using some form of identification close enough to pass as yours, that's not just civil fraud anymore. That's a criminal matter, identity-related, and it changes everything about how fast and how aggressively we can move. I drove home that afternoon and sat with the strange, dislocating fact that my son's ex-wife, a woman who'd sat at my Thanksgiving table for 3 years, who'd once cried in my kitchen after a miscarriage I'd never told anyone else about, who I had genuinely, fully liked, might have stood in a strip mall office and signed my name to a document transferring my house, while looking enough like me to fool a stranger doing his job in a hurry. 3 days later, Renata's investigator came back with something that reframed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. Brianna hadn't actually divorced Gary 18 months ago, the way I'd believed the whole time. The divorce had finalized only 7 months ago, which meant that for nearly a year of the time, Gary had told me he was recovering from the divorce. Staying in my old guest room, he and Brianna had still, legally, been married. And during those same months, financial records the investigator was able to access through public bankruptcy filings showed Brianna had opened 3 new credit lines, each one eventually maxed out, each one tied to an address in Golden, the same apartment Gary had told me his new job was helping him afford. They weren't divorced and struggling separately. They were still entangled, financially and otherwise, far longer and far more deeply than Gary had ever told me, right through the exact window when the deed was forged and notarized. I called Gary again that evening, and this time I didn't write out my questions in advance, because I wanted to hear unprepared and unrehearsed. However, he responded to the one thing I now knew that he didn't yet know I knew. Gary, when exactly did your divorce from Brianna actually finalize? A pause. Shorter this time, more careful. 7 months ago. Why does that matter right now? Because you told me 18 months ago that you two had already split, and you moved into my house claiming you needed somewhere to land after the divorce. But the divorce wasn't final yet. You were still married to her the entire time you were living under my roof, telling me you were single and struggling. Were you two still together this whole time, Gary? Is that what this actually is? The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. It's complicated, Mom. It's not complicated, Gary. It's either true or it isn't. Is Brianna the woman who went to that notary's office and signed my name? Another silence, and then, instead of an answer, a different sentence entirely, quiet, almost defeated. Mom, there's something else you need to know before this goes any further. And I think it's actually worse than the deed. What's worse than forging my signature and selling my house? The buyer. Marcus's client. The one under contract to close on the 17th. Mom, I think you need to sit down for this part, because I didn't find out who it actually was until 2 days ago myself, and I don't know how to tell you in a way that doesn't make this so much worse. Part 4, Gary told me the buyer's name over the phone, and for a moment it meant nothing to me at all, because it was a company name, not a person's, Cedarbrook Holdings LLC, which struck me as strange the second I heard it, since the company shared its name with the street I'd lived on for 22 years, a coincidence too specific to actually be a coincidence. Gary, who owns Cedarbrook Holdings? Mom, I didn't set it up. I want you to believe me about that part at least. Brianna's brother does. Felix. He's been doing real estate investment stuff for a couple years now, flipping houses, that kind of thing. He's the one who actually approached me about this whole idea in the first place, back in the spring. He said there was a way to get equity out of the house quickly, said he knew people, said it would all be clean and quiet and you'd never have to know until it was already done and the money was already helping fix things. So this wasn't your idea. It started as his idea. I went along with it because I was desperate and because Brianna kept telling me you'd understand eventually that you'd rather have the money go to helping me than sit in a house by yourself with 3 empty bedrooms. I sat with that sentence for a long moment after we hung up. You'd rather have the money go to helping me than sit in a house by yourself. Because it was the kind of thing that sounded, on its surface, almost loving, almost like something I actually might have said myself in a softer moment. And that was exactly what made it so unsettling. Somebody had taken something true about me, my willingness to help my son, and used it as the architecture for a plan that never once involved actually asking me, Renata's investigator, Connie, a different Connie than my sister had mentioned in passing once before, apparently a fairly common name among the small circle of forensic specialists who do this kind of work in the Denver area, pulled the records on Felix Marchetti within 2 days. He had, in fact, flipped several houses over the previous 3 years, but 2 of those transactions had drawn brief attention from the Jefferson County District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit 18 months earlier, an investigation that had apparently stalled out for lack of a cooperating victim willing to testify. Patricia, Renata said, when she called to walk me through what Connie had found, I think Felix Marchetti has done some version of this before, using a family insider, often someone going through financial stress or family conflict, to access a property's title cheaply, under market value, structured to close fast before anyone outside the immediate family notices. The previous case involved an elderly father and a stepson. It fell apart before charges were filed, because the father, embarrassed and still emotionally attached to the stepson, refused to pursue it. And you think that's what Felix is counting on with me? That I'll be too embarrassed or too attached to Gary to actually follow through. I think that's exactly what everyone in this, including your own son, on some level, is counting on. I don't say that to be harsh, Patricia. I say it because I think it's important for you to recognize the pattern so you can decide, clearly, whether you're willing to be the exception to it. That evening, Donna, my sister, came over with a bottle of wine. Neither of us drank and sat with me at the kitchen table while I went through old photographs of Thanksgivings with Brianna in them, trying to locate the exact moment, if there even was one, where the woman who'd cried in my kitchen about a miscarriage had become someone capable of standing in a stranger's office, signing my name to a deed. Patricia, I need to tell you something, and I should have told you months ago. Donna's voice had an unfamiliar hesitance in it, the kind I almost never heard from her. Brianna called me back in the spring. Around April, I think, she asked, very casually, whether I knew if you'd ever consider selling Cedarbrook and helping Gary with the proceeds. I told her I didn't think you'd ever sell that house, not in 100 years, and I didn't think much more about it after that. I should have called you. I'm sorry. I genuinely thought it was just idle conversation. You've known since April that someone was thinking about this? I've known since April that someone was wondering out loud about it. I didn't know. Patricia, I swear to you, I had no idea anyone was actually planning to forge anything. I thought it was just one of those uncomfortable conversations families sometimes have around money, the kind you brush off and forget. I didn't blame Donna, not really, not once I'd had time to actually sit with it. But something in me shifted that evening anyway, a small recalibration of how much I could fully trust my own sense of who was simply talking and who was actually moving pieces into place the whole time. Renata called the next morning with news that pushed everything else briefly out of my mind. Patricia, the closing on the 17th. That's 6 days from now. I've already started the paperwork for an emergency injunction to halt it, based on the fraud allegations and the notary's statement. But I need to tell you something else first. Felix Marchetti's attorney called my office an hour ago. Not about the injunction, about you specifically. He wants to set up a meeting, informally, before we file anything formal with the court. Patricia, in 20 years of doing this work, I can tell you that when the other side's lawyer wants to talk to the victim before any paperwork is filed, it's almost never because they think they're going to win. Part 5. The meeting happened 2 days later, not at Renata's office, but at a coffee shop on Colfax Avenue that Felix Marchetti's attorney had suggested, a choice Renata flagged immediately as deliberate. Public enough to feel informal and harmless, but without a court reporter, without recordings unless someone brought their own, without anything that would create a record either side could later point to, Renata came with me. Felix's attorney, a heavyset man named Robert Castellanos, who introduced himself with a handshake that lasted slightly too long, opened by saying he wanted to find a path forward that worked for everyone. The kind of sentence that meant, I was already learning, something closer to its opposite. Mrs. Doyle, I want to be direct with you, Castellanos said, sliding a folder across the table that I didn't open. My client purchased that property in good faith, relying on a notarized deed that, at the time of the transaction, carried every appearance of legitimacy. If you pursue this through the courts, you're not just taking on your son. You're taking on a buyer who did nothing wrong from a legal standpoint, and litigation like that can take years, Mrs. Doyle. Years and a great deal of money you may not have, fighting a presumption of validity that the law generally favors. Mr. Castellanos, your client's company is named after the street my house sits on. That's not a coincidence that suggests good faith to me. He didn't flinch, which told me he'd anticipated that exact observation. Coincidences happen, Mrs. Doyle. My client has named several holding entities after streets relevant to their respective properties. It's an administrative convenience, nothing more. Retechu leaned forward slightly. Mr. Castellanos, we have a sworn statement from the notary confirming the woman who appeared before him was not Mrs. Doyle. We have financial records showing your client's sister, who was still legally married to Mrs. Doyle's son at the time, had every motive and opportunity to be that woman. And we have a documented pattern from your client's previous transactions that the district attorney's economic crimes unit already looked into once before. I'd encourage you to reconsider how confident you actually feel about that presumption of validity holding up. Something shifted in Castellanos' face, brief but real, and for the first time since we'd sat down, his next sentence came slower, more careful. I think there may be room for a negotiated resolution here that avoids putting everyone through a lengthy court process. My client would be willing to release the property back to Mrs. Doyle, with the contract simply unwinding, no admission of wrongdoing on anyone's part, if Mrs. Doyle agrees not to pursue any further claims, civil or otherwise, against my client or anyone connected to this transaction. I understood, sitting there with my untouched coffee going cold, exactly what was being offered, and exactly what it was meant to bury. They would give me my house back. In exchange, Felix Marchetti would walk away clean. Brianna would never face anything for what the notary swore she'd done, and Gary, whatever role he'd actually played, willing or coerced or somewhere uncomfortably in between, would never have to answer for any of it in front of anyone but me. No, I said, before Renata even had the chance to respond on my behalf. I'm not interested in getting my house back quietly while everyone who helped take it walks away like nothing happened. Castellanos' calm slipped a little further. Mrs. Doyle, I'd encourage you to consider the cost and the time involved in pursuing this further. Litigation against my client could take. Mr. Castellanos, Renata interrupted, her voice even but unmistakably sharper than it had been a moment earlier. You should also consider that the longer this drags on, the more discovery opens up around your client's previous transactions, the ones the DA already looked at once. My client isn't asking your client to admit guilt today. She's telling you she's not interested in protecting your client's reputation in exchange for her own house back. Those are two very different positions, and I'd suggest you take that distinction back to Mr. Marchetti exactly as I've stated it. We left 20 minutes later, and in the parking lot, Renata turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before, not quite a smile, but close to one. Patricia, that offer they just made tells us something important. They're scared. Genuinely scared, not just posturing. A buyer confident in the legitimacy of his purchase doesn't offer to unwind a contract for free, just to make a fraud claim go away quietly. He does that when he knows exactly how bad it would look if this actually went in front of a judge. That night, Gary called me again, his voice different than I'd heard it in the previous calls. Smaller, stripped of the careful explanations he'd been offering all week. Mom, Felix called me. He's furious. He said, "You're going to ruin all of us if you don't take the deal," he said. Gary's voice caught. He said if this goes to court, he's going to make sure it comes out that I knew everything from the beginning, that I asked Brianna to do it, that none of this was her idea or his. Mom, I don't know what's true anymore about who decided what. I just know I'm scared, and I don't know how to fix what I started without losing everything, including you. Part 6. I drove to Renata's office the next morning with Gary's confession from the night before still sitting heavy in my chest, not because it surprised me anymore, but because hearing him say, "I don't know what's true anymore about who decided what," had told me something important, that whatever this had started as, it had grown well past anyone's ability to fully control, including the people who'd started it. I want to record him, I told Renata. Gary. If he's willing to actually tell the truth about what happened, on the record, I want it documented before Felix has the chance to convince him to change his story. Renata considered that carefully. Patricia, I need to be straightforward with you about something delicate. Colorado is a one-party consent state, which means you're legally allowed to record a phone call with Gary without his knowledge, since you're a participant in the conversation. But I want you to think hard about whether you want to do this covertly or whether you'd rather ask him directly to sit down with me, formally, and give a statement. The covert route might capture something more raw and unguarded. The formal route is cleaner, more usable, and frankly, Patricia, it gives Gary a chance to actually choose honesty instead of having it taken from him in a moment of fear. I think that distinction might matter to you, given everything. It did matter to me, more than I expected it to in that moment. I called Gary that afternoon and asked him to come to Renata's office in person the next day. He didn't argue. He sounded, if anything, almost relieved. The way people sound when a decision they've been avoiding finally gets made for them by someone else asking the right question at the right time. He arrived the next morning looking like he hadn't slept, and for the first 90 minutes in Renata's conference room, with her assistant taking down a formal statement, Gary told a version of events considerably more complicated than anything he'd offered me over the phone. Felix had approached him in March, not with a vague idea, but with an actual structured proposal, a quitclaim transfer, a notary contact. Felix said he knew personally and trusted, a sale price set deliberately below market value in exchange for a faster, quieter close. Brianna, according to Gary, had been the one who'd actually gone to the notary's office, using an old driver's license of mine that Gary admitted, with visible shame, he'd taken from my house months earlier and given to her, along with copies of documents containing my actual signature for her to study and replicate. I told myself I'd pay you back before you ever found out, Gary said, his voice flat in the way of someone too exhausted to keep performing remorse instead of simply having it. I told myself it wasn't really stealing if I was planning to make it right eventually. I think I believed that for a while. I don't really believe it anymore. Renata's assistant got every word of it on the record, signed, dated, witnessed. That same afternoon, Connie, Renata's investigator, called with something that shifted the entire balance of the case again. While digging through Felix Marchesitti's financial history in preparation for the injunction hearing, she'd found wire transfers from a shell account connected to Cedarbrook Holdings, LLC, into an account belonging to the notary's strip mall office, dated 2 days before the deed was signed. Not a notary fee, $4,000, far beyond any standard notarization charge, sent directly from the buyer's own company to the office that had certified the fraudulent signature. Patricia, Renata said, laying the wire transfer printout on the table between us. This changes things substantially. It's no longer just your son's confession and a notary's recollection. We now have direct financial evidence connecting the buyer's company to the person who falsely certified the deed, paid 2 days before the fraud occurred. That's not coincidence. That's premeditation, and it's the kind of thing that moves a case from a civil fraud claim into something a district attorney would be very interested in picking back up, especially given the prior unresolved investigation into Felix's other transactions. I sat with the weight of that for a long moment, the realization that I was no longer simply trying to get my house back, but was holding, in a manila folder on a conference table in Lakewood, Colorado, enough evidence to potentially reopen a stalled criminal investigation that had quietly failed once before because an embarrassed, attached victim hadn't been willing to see it through. What happens now? I asked. Now, Renata said, we stop negotiating quietly in coffee shops and we file everything we have. The injunction, the notary's statement, Gary's formal confession, and this wire transfer, all at once, publicly, through the court. I want Felix and his attorney walking into the next conversation, already knowing there isn't a quiet version of this left for them to offer you. Patricia, I need you to be ready. Because once this is filed, there's no controlling how Felix responds, and based on everything we already know about him, I don't think he goes down without trying to drag as many people as possible down with him first. Part 7, the filing went in on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday, exactly the way Renata had warned me it would, Felix Marchetti's attorney called requesting an emergency hearing, not to negotiate, but because his client wanted, in Castellanos's words, the opportunity to clear his name before the court, before public filings damage his business reputation further than they already have. The hearing took place in a Jefferson County courtroom on a gray Thursday morning, smaller and more ordinary than I'd expected. No audience. No drama beyond the people directly involved. A judge named Howard Reyes who listened with the unhurried patience of someone who had clearly seen every flavor of family financial disaster cross his courtroom over the years. Renata presented first. The notary's sworn statement, Gary's formal confession, the wire transfer records. Castellanos, when his turn came, tried a different approach than the coffee shop, arguing that even if irregularities existed in how the deed was obtained, his client had purchased the property believing in good faith that the transaction was legitimate and shouldn't bear responsibility for fraud committed by other parties. It was Felix himself, called to testify under oath, who unraveled that argument without anyone needing to push very hard. Mr. Marchetti, Renata asked, can you explain the $4,000 wire transfer from your company to the notary's business account, sent 2 days before the deed in question was signed? Felix glanced at Castellanos before answering, the kind of glance that told the entire courtroom he hadn't been prepared for this specific question to land quite this directly. That was a referral fee. For business he sends my way sometimes. documents, closings, that kind of thing. A referral fee paid 2 days before a fraudulent notarization that benefited your company directly for a transaction that hadn't happened yet at the time of payment. I didn't know it was going to be fraudulent. Then why pay a referral fee in advance before any service related to your business had actually been performed? Felix didn't have an answer for that one, and the silence that followed did more damage to his credibility than any document Renata could have placed in front of the judge. Gary testified next, and watching my own son sit in a witness chair under oath, telling a Jefferson County judge the full truth about taking my old driver's license from my house, about handing it to Brianna, about the months of slowly convincing himself that what he was doing wasn't really stealing, because he intended to make it right eventually. Watching that, I felt something complicated settle in my chest that wasn't quite forgiveness, and wasn't quite the anger I'd been carrying for 2.5 weeks either. It was closer to grief, the specific grief of watching someone you raised become, in a courtroom, fully accountable for exactly who he'd chosen to be when no one was supposed to be watching. "Why didn't you just ask your mother for help, Mr. Doyle?" Judge Reyes asked at one point, not unkindly, the question of a man who had clearly wondered the same thing throughout the entire proceeding. Gary was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was ashamed, Your Honor. I'd already failed at my marriage. I was drowning in debt I didn't know how to explain to her, and Felix made it sound like there was a way to fix everything without ever having to tell her how badly I'd actually messed up my own life. I think some part of me wanted to fix it before she ever had to know there was anything to fix. I understand now that's not actually love. It's just a different kind of lying." Brianna, who had been subpoenaed but had not appeared, was held to be in contempt, a detail Renata told me afterward. Would likely accelerate any criminal referral the district attorney's office decided to pursue based on the notary's identification of her. Judge Reyes didn't rule from the bench that day. He took the matter under advisement, which Renata explained simply meant he wanted time to write a full, careful order given how many moving parts. The fraud claim, the contempt finding, the question of the sale's validity were now tangled together in a single case. I drove home that afternoon past the for sale sign, still standing crooked in my yard, exactly where Marcus Trans Company had planted it weeks earlier, nobody having bothered yet to take it down while the case worked its way through the system. I sat in my driveway the way I had the very first day, looking at that sign, except this time I understood completely how it had gotten there, who had helped put it there, and how close I had come to losing the only thing in my life I had ever paid for entirely with my own 2 jobs and my own 2 hands. What I didn't yet know, sitting there, was what Judge Reyes's written order would actually say, or what would happen to Gary once the criminal referral against Brianna and Felix moved forward, or whether my own son would face any charges of his own for the part Renata had carefully, deliberately, not yet asked the judge to formally address. Part 8, Judge Reyes's written order came down 11 days later, and Renata read it to me over the phone before I'd even had my morning coffee, because she said she didn't want me finding out the details from a mailed copy sitting alone at my kitchen table. The quitclaim deed was voided in full, the fraud finding written into the order in plain, unambiguous language. The sale to Cedarbrook Holdings LLC was nullified. The property restored entirely to my name, exactly as it had been before any of this started. Felix Marchetti was ordered to pay my legal fees in full, along with a civil penalty Renata said was modest by the standards of what he could actually afford, but symbolically important, because the order explicitly referenced the prior, stalled investigation into his other transactions. Language Renata said all but guaranteed the district attorney's office would take a second, harder look this time, with an actual cooperating victim willing to see it through. Brianna was charged criminally 3 weeks later. Forgery and identity theft. both felonies under Colorado law, based on the notary's identification and the wire transfer trail Connie had uncovered. She eventually pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, accepting 18 months of probation and restitution, a resolution Renata described as realistic, not cinematic. Not the dramatic conviction you might picture, but a genuine consequence that would follow her, on paper, for years. Gary was never criminally charged. The district attorney's office, after reviewing his formal confession and his cooperation throughout the case, decided his role, while deeply wrong, didn't rise to the same level as the people who'd engineered and executed the actual fraud. I don't know, even now, whether I'm entirely at peace with that outcome. Some days I think it's fair, given how thoroughly Felix and Brianna used his shame and his desperation as the hinge their entire plan turned on. Other days I think a part of me wanted him to face something more, some consequence size to match what he'd actually done to me, not just what he'd been talked into doing by people more calculating than him. What Gary did face was something harder to put a legal name to. He moved out of the Golden apartment within a month, unable to keep up with rent that, it turned out, Brianna's family had been quietly subsidizing the whole time as part of an arrangement none of us fully understood until everything came apart. He's renting a small room from a coworker now, working extra shifts at the warehouse job he'd actually been telling the truth about for once, slowly paying down debt that has nothing romantic or redemptive about how slowly it's disappearing. We talk now, but carefully, the way you talk to someone you love, whose judgment you no longer trust the way you used to. He comes to dinner on Sundays sometimes. He asked, a few months ago, almost shyly, whether I'd consider letting him help with yard work around the house in exchange for nothing. No money changing hands at all. Just time, just presence, just some small repeated proof that he wanted to be useful to me again without anything attached to it. I said yes. He's mowed my lawn 11 times since then. I haven't asked him to stop, and I haven't quite told him how much it actually means yet either. Donna and I are closer now than we were before any of this, in the strange way that surviving something together sometimes does that, even when part of what you survived was her own slow, regretful silence back in the spring. I forgave her for that months ago. I think some part of her still hasn't fully forgiven herself. I went back to work at the hospital 2 weeks after the court order, billing codes and insurance forms exactly the way they'd always been, except now I find myself, every so often, glancing at patients' paperwork a little more carefully than I used to, checking signatures against IDs out of a habit I never had before. The small permanent residue a thing like this leaves behind in how you move through the rest of your ordinary life. I had the for sale sign removed myself, finally, the week after the ruling came through. Marcus Tran, when I called him one last time, was apologetic in a way that felt genuine and told me he'd had no idea any of it was fraudulent. That he'd simply been doing his job with documents that looked to him entirely legitimate. I believed him. He wasn't part of this. He was just the first stranger's voice that happened to answer the phone the day I found out my own life had quietly changed shape without me. Some evenings now, I sit on the back porch of the house on Cedarbrook Lane, the same house I paid off 3 years early, working double shifts. After a divorce, nobody thought I'd survive financially either, and I watch Gary push the mower across the same lawn he once tried to sell out from under me. And I think about how strange it is that the thing which almost cost me everything turned out, in the end, to be the thing that taught both of us, slowly and at considerable cost, exactly what we were actually willing to fight to keep.